Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson had always prided herself on the discipline and strength it took to rise through the ranks of the U.S. Navy. As a black woman in the military, she knew that she had to work harder than most to prove her abilities and earn the respect of her peers. But today wasn't about work. Today, she was just a passenger on a flight heading to an important mission overseas. She was looking forward to some quiet time, a chance to relax before the busy schedule ahead. The flight was scheduled to take her from Washington, D.C. to a military base abroad, where she would join a new team and take on a critical role. As she boarded the plane, she felt a sense of calm. There would be no uniforms to wear, no military orders to follow, just the quiet hum of the airplane and the chance to reflect. Aisha walked down the aisle, her black dress uniform neatly pressed, as always. She had just finished a grueling week of preparation, and now she was looking forward to a few hours of peace. She made her way to her seat in the economy section. It was a standard seat, nothing too special, but it would be enough. She smiled to herself, thinking about how far she had come in her career. She had earned the right to sit wherever she liked, and the small space of economy didn't bother her. As she sat down and settled in, she noticed the flight attendants moving through the aisle, smiling politely at the passengers as they began their routine check. Aisha nodded to one of them as she took out a small notebook from her bag, ready to start jotting down some thoughts about the upcoming mission. But as the flight attendants moved closer to Aisha, something unexpected happened. They paused when they reached her seat. One of the attendants, a young woman with blonde hair, gave Aisha a quick but curious glance. Aisha, knowing how people sometimes reacted to her uniform, smiled politely. But instead of simply passing by, the attendant hesitated for a moment. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant began, her voice a little uncertain. "I believe you may have been assigned to the wrong seat. Would you mind coming with me? I think there's been a mix-up." Aisha blinked, unsure what the attendant meant. "I'm fine here," she replied politely. "This is my seat." The attendant seemed momentarily confused, glancing back at her colleague, who was standing a few steps behind. "I'm so sorry," the attendant said quickly, "but I think you might be in the wrong class. You're supposed to be in first class." Aisha was surprised. She knew there had been no upgrade request, and she wasn't expecting any special treatment. She had always traveled in economy class, like most people, but the attendant's insistence made her raise an eyebrow. "I'm okay here," Aisha responded with a gentle smile. "Thank you, but this is where I'm comfortable." The attendant seemed unsure, but after a moment, she smiled nervously. "Well, if you're sure." She hesitated and then moved away to continue her rounds, though Aisha could sense the lingering confusion. Aisha looked out the window, wondering what had just happened. It wasn't the first time someone had mistaken her rank or assumed that she didn't belong in certain spaces, but she hadn't expected it on this flight. She leaned back in her seat, deciding not to let the moment bother her. After all, she was here for a reason, no matter where she sat. The moment the flight attendants turned away, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson tried to shake off the awkwardness that had just unfolded. She wasn't the kind of person who let small misunderstandings bother her, but there was something about the way the young attendant had spoken to her that stuck with her. She had assumed that Aisha didn't belong where she was sitting. Aisha settled into her seat again, trying to focus on her mission notes. She thought about the tasks ahead, about the team she was about to join, and about the challenges she was ready to face. But even as she opened her notebook, the feeling of being misunderstood lingered in her mind. A few minutes passed, and the flight continued smoothly. The plane's engines hummed steadily in the background, and passengers relaxed, enjoying their drinks and snacks. But then, the flight attendants made another round, and this time, the same young attendant who had spoken to Aisha earlier approached her again. "Excuse me, Mom," the attendant said with a hesitant smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you to come with me." Aisha raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Is something wrong?" she asked, not sure what to expect. "We've been asked to move you to another seat in the first-class section," the attendant said, her voice more firm this time. "We believe there's been a mistake with your seating assignment, and we just need to get this sorted out." Aisha could see that the attendant was trying to be polite, but there was something about her tone that suggested the young woman still didn't quite believe Aisha should be in economy. It was the assumption that bothered Aisha more than anything else. She didn't like being treated like she didn't belong. "I told you earlier, I'm fine here," Aisha replied, maintaining her calm. "I didn't ask for an upgrade. I'm happy in this seat." The attendant hesitated for a moment, then looked back at her colleague, who had joined them near the aisle. "Ma'am," the other attendant said, stepping forward, "we've double-checked the seating arrangements, and it appears you've been placed in economy by mistake. We're just following procedure, and we really need to get this straightened out." Aisha shook her head slightly. "No mistake. I chose this seat myself. I'm comfortable where I am." The attendants seemed caught in an uncomfortable position, unsure of how to respond. It was clear that they weren't convinced by Aisha's insistence, and they were still determined to get her to move. Aisha couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and disappointment. She had worked hard to get to where she was, and yet here she was, being treated as if she didn't belong. She could see the passengers around her starting to notice the exchange. Some of them looked on curiously, others shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Aisha took a deep breath, deciding that the situation needed to be resolved once and for all. She wasn't about to let this go any longer. With a calm but firm voice, Aisha stood up, signaling that it was time to end the back and forth. "I'm not moving to first class," she said, locking eyes with the attendants. "Not because I don't deserve it, but because I'm fine where I am." The attendants looked at each other, clearly unsure of what to do next. Aisha could feel the tension building, but she held her ground. It wasn't about the seat. It was about being seen for who she was and not for assumptions about her place. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson felt the tension building as the flight attendants continued to look at her with uncertainty. She had thought the situation would be cleared up after their first conversation, but it seemed the misunderstanding wasn't over. She returned to her seat, trying to focus on her thoughts and the work she had planned for the flight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Aisha had been in the Navy for over 10 years. She had earned every stripe on her uniform, facing challenges and overcoming obstacles that many could never imagine. As a black woman in a demanding field, she had worked harder than most to prove herself and rise to the rank she held today. It wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. However, today, none of her accomplishments seemed to matter. Instead, she was being treated like someone who didn't belong in the seat she had carefully chosen. Just as Aisha was beginning to settle back into her thoughts, the flight attendants returned. This time, they moved with more urgency, stopping in front of her seat once again. "Excuse me, Mom," the young attendant said, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm really sorry, but I need to ask you to come with me. There's been a mistake with your seating. You're supposed to be in first class." Aisha blinked in surprise. "I'm fine here," she replied calmly, not understanding why they were still insisting on this. "I haven't asked for an upgrade. This is where I'm sitting, and I'm comfortable." The attendant looked unsure but tried to press on. "I understand, ma'am, but it's company policy. We need to move you to first class." Aisha took a deep breath, maintaining her calm. She understood that the attendants were just doing their job, but the assumption that she didn't belong in economy because of her uniform bothered her. She had been in the Navy long enough to know that not everyone saw her as an officer just because of what she wore. People often assumed things about her based on her appearance, and today was no different. "I told you earlier," Aisha said with a gentle firmness. "I'm perfectly fine where I am. There's no need to move me." The attendant hesitated, glancing back at her colleague. "But Mom," she said slowly, "you're a Navy officer, and with your rank, you should be sitting in first class." The words hit Aisha like a cold wave. She had worked so hard to achieve the rank she held, But it seemed like all they saw was a uniform, nothing more. The idea that she would be treated as if she didn't belong where she was sitting, just because she was a black woman in a military uniform, was frustrating. She stood up from her seat, locking eyes with the flight attendants. "Let me make this clear," Aisha said with quiet authority. "I am Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson of the United States Navy, and I am not moving." The flight attendants froze. The words hung in the air as they processed what Aisha had just revealed. A moment of silence passed, and then one of the attendants stammered an apology, realizing their mistake. I didn't know," the attendant murmured, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize." Aisha smiled slightly, her voice calm. "It's all right. But please, next time, don't assume." The tension in the air was thick. Aisha could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some glancing her way with curiosity, others shifting in their seats awkwardly. The flight attendants, now clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped back a little, still unsure of how to handle it. Aisha's calm but firm response had already made it clear that she wasn't going to move, but the confusion didn't seem to be over. The young attendant who had first approached her continued to look flustered. "I'm really sorry, ma'am," she said again, "but we need to confirm this with the captain. We just want to make sure there hasn't been any misunderstanding." Aisha nodded, her patience wearing thin, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand. I'm not angry. But I've already explained that I'm fine here. There's no mistake." The attendants exchanged uncertain glances. Aisha could see that they still weren't convinced. It wasn't just the seating issue anymore. It was something deeper. The assumption that a black woman in a Navy uniform didn't belong in economy class was clear to her, and it stung. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the subtle judgment. "Let me go and check with the captain," the attendant said, her voice quieter now. She turned and walked down the aisle, leaving Aisha standing there. Aisha took a deep breath, trying to calm the thoughts swirling in her mind. She had seen this kind of situation before, where people assumed things about her because of the color of her skin or her uniform. It was tiring, but she wouldn't let it shake her. As the attendant spoke to the captain, the plane continued its smooth flight, the gentle hum of the engines a reminder that life went on, even when misunderstandings like this happened. Aisha glanced out of the window, letting her thoughts drift. She had joined the Navy years ago, determined to build a career in a space where not many looked like her. It hadn't been easy, but she had earned her place every step of the way. And yet, here she was, being treated like she didn't belong. The minutes stretched on, and Aisha's calm exterior never faltered. She wasn't going to be moved. She wasn't going to let anyone question her place. She had earned every right to sit where she pleased, and no one would take that away from her. Eventually, the attendant returned, this time with a different tone in her voice. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she said softly. "I've spoken with the captain. He told me that everything is fine, but he did want to extend his apologies for the misunderstanding. We had no idea about your rank." Aisha nodded, still maintaining her calm. "Thank you, but I don't think it should have come to this in the first place." The attendant's face reddened slightly. "You're absolutely right. I apologize for the confusion." The whole situation had become more than just a seating mix-up. It was about assumptions, biases, and the way people looked at her. Aisha knew that in moments like this, the best thing she could do was stay composed, show respect, and demand the same in return. As the attendant walked away, Aisha could feel the weight of the moment lift just a little. It wasn't over yet, but at least there had been an acknowledgement of the mistake. She returned to her seat, focusing on the work she had brought with her for the flight. There would be more to deal with once she reached her destination, but for now, she had shown them all who she really was. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted. The tension that hung in the air was now palpable, with passengers watching the exchange between Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson and the flight attendants. It had become clear to everyone that this wasn't just a simple mix-up. There was more going on here, something much deeper than just a seating error. Aisha could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some glancing her way with curiosity, while others whispered to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. She remained calm, keeping her posture straight and her expression steady. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations like this was to stay composed, to show strength in the face of discomfort. The flight attendants had stepped away for a moment, but Aisha knew they would return soon. She had already made it clear that she wasn't moving. She didn't need to explain herself any further. Still, she couldn't help but wonder why they had assumed so much about her based on her uniform and appearance. Moments later, the same young attendant who had approached her earlier returned. This time, she seemed even more unsure of what to do next. She stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am, I really apologize for all the confusion," the attendant said, her voice soft. "We just want to make sure everything is okay. We spoke to the captain, and he wanted to speak with you directly." Aisha looked at the attendant, her calm expression unwavering. "I'm listening," she said, her tone respectful but firm. The attendant stepped aside, motioning for Aisha to follow her. She walked towards the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was open. The captain was standing just inside, looking at Aisha with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, I'm Captain Reynolds," the pilot said, extending his hand with a polite smile. "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. We've cleared up the seating situation, but I felt it was important to speak with you directly." Aisha shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you, Captain," she replied calmly. "But I think we should have addressed this sooner. There's no need for all this confusion." Captain Reynolds nodded, his face reddening slightly with embarrassment. "You're absolutely right. I had no idea who you were when I was told about the situation. I deeply regret the mistake." Aisha took a deep breath. "I'm not angry, but I do want to make one thing clear. I'm a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. I've worked hard for my rank, and I don't appreciate being treated as if I don't belong." The captain's eyes widened in understanding. "Of course, I'm sorry for the way things were handled. It was a mistake on our part, and I assure you it won't happen again." Aisha nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that, but this is more than just about the seating. It's about understanding that appearances can be deceiving. I may not look like what you expect, but I'm just as qualified as anyone else in that first-class cabin." Captain Reynolds nodded again, looking genuinely remorseful. "You're right. We should have recognized your rank from the start. Please accept my apologies on behalf of the entire crew. I want you to know that we value your service and will make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight." Aisha smiled slightly, her voice steady. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot." As she returned to her seat, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The misunderstanding had been cleared up, but more importantly, she had stood her ground. She had shown everyone that she wouldn't be treated as less than what she was, and that, in the end, was more important than any seat on a plane. After Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson returned to her seat, the entire cabin felt different. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to lift slightly, but there was still an unspoken weight lingering. Passengers who had been watching the scene quietly whispered to each other, their curiosity piqued by the events that had just unfolded. Aisha sat back in her seat, trying to focus on the mission notes she had been reviewing before the interruption, but her mind kept drifting back to the encounter. She had handled herself calmly, but deep down, she was frustrated. It wasn't just about the mistaken seating, it was about the assumptions people made based on her appearance. She had spent years in the Navy proving herself, fighting harder than most to rise through the ranks. And yet there she was, being treated as if she didn't belong in a seat she had chosen for herself. The thought of how easily others judged her still stung. As a black woman in the military, she had encountered similar situations before. People would sometimes question her abilities or doubt her role, simply because they didn't expect to see someone like her in leadership positions. But Aisha had always chosen to stand tall, to meet those challenges head-on. Today, she would do the same. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by, letting the gentle hum of the plane soothe her thoughts. But soon, she was interrupted by a soft voice from behind her. "Mom." Aisha turned to see one of the flight attendants standing in the aisle, looking a bit nervous. She smiled politely, though it was clear that she was still unsettled by what had happened earlier. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, I'm really sorry about what happened," the flight attendant said, her voice sincere. "I just wanted to apologize on behalf of the crew for the misunderstanding. We didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable." Aisha smiled back at her, nodding. "Thank you. I appreciate the apology." The attendant seemed relieved but still hesitant. "I think we all learned something today," she said softly. "It's easy to assume things based on what we see, but it's important to remember that everyone has their own story, their own worth." Aisha nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Exactly. It's about respect. And that goes both ways." The attendant paused for a moment, as if she were considering Aisha's words. "You're right, Ma'am," she said after a beat. "And I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you for your patience." Aisha could see the genuine regret in the flight attendant's eyes. And for a moment, she softened her posture. She wasn't angry anymore. In fact, she realized that this situation had given her a chance to teach someone a valuable lesson. It wasn't about being upset. It was about using the opportunity to help others understand and learn from their mistakes. The attendant gave a small bow of her head before turning and walking away, leaving Aisha to reflect. As the flight continued, the crew became more attentive, offering Aisha extra comfort, as though trying to make up for the earlier tension. The captain had even sent a note to her via the flight attendants, expressing his gratitude for her patience and acknowledging the mistake. As the plane flew smoothly toward its destination, Aisha couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had used the moment to remind others of the importance of respect. The incident wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a chance to change how people thought about others, to challenge the assumptions that often came so easily. And that was something she could be proud of. As the plane continued its smooth flight, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few hours. She had made it clear to the flight attendants that she wasn't going to be moved from her seat, but there was still something lingering in the air. She wasn't angry, but the situation had left her thinking about how easily assumptions were made, even by people who should know better. Aisha was a Navy officer, a leader in her field, and yet she had been treated as if she didn't belong. The uncomfortable feeling of being underestimated stayed with her, even as the flight continued at cruising altitude. She had learned long ago to be strong in the face of adversity, but that didn't mean it was always easy to shake off. Just as she started to dive back into her work, her thoughts were interrupted by an announcement over the intercom. The captain's voice was calm and clear, but there was something different in his tone today. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I just want to take a moment to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier with one of our passengers. I've had the chance to speak with Lieutenant Commander Thompson, and I want to publicly acknowledge her service to our country and express my gratitude for her patience and understanding. We are proud to have her aboard today." Aisha's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the captain to make an announcement like this, especially not in front of the entire cabin. The moment was strange, but at the same time, it was a reminder that people could change their perspective when they were given the right information. She glanced around, surprised to see the reactions of the passengers. Many of them had been quietly watching the situation unfold, but now they seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. Some passengers smiled and nodded in recognition. Others seemed a bit embarrassed by their earlier assumptions. The announcement had made it clear to everyone that Aisha wasn't just another uniformed passenger. She was someone to be respected. As the captain finished speaking, Aisha felt a wave of gratitude. While the situation had been uncomfortable, it was also an opportunity to bring awareness to the importance of understanding and respect. People often assumed things based on appearances, but this was a chance to show that there was more to someone than what met the eye. A few minutes later, the flight attendants returned to her seat. This time, they looked at her with a new sense of respect, their earlier hesitation replaced with genuine apologies. "Lieutenant Commander, we just wanted to thank you again for your patience," one of the attendants said, offering her a small gift as a token of their apology. "We didn't mean to offend you, and we truly appreciate everything you do for our country." Aisha accepted the gift with a smile, feeling a sense of relief. She wasn't seeking special treatment, but the acknowledgement of her rank and the work she had done meant more than any apology could. It was a small gesture, but it showed that change was possible. As the plane flew toward its destination, the passengers around her seemed more aware of the need to treat others with respect. Aisha could sense that the misunderstanding had opened the door for learning, and she was grateful for the opportunity to be a part of that. For the rest of the flight, the mood lightened. Conversations flowed more easily, and there was a quiet understanding that sometimes it took a little more than a first impression to truly see who someone was. Aisha had shown them all that respect wasn't about rank or appearances. It was about treating people with dignity, no matter their background or position. The rest of the flight passed without incident. As the plane flew through the sky, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The situation had started as something small, a simple misunderstanding, but it had grown into something much more important. Aisha had always known that she faced challenges in her career as a black woman in the military, but this moment had shown her just how deep those challenges could go. People often made assumptions about her based on the way she looked or what they thought they knew about her. But today, she had stood her ground and made it clear that she wouldn't let anyone define her by their misconceptions. Aisha wasn't angry anymore. She understood that the flight attendants had made a mistake, and she knew that they hadn't intended to make her feel uncomfortable. They had apologized, and the captain had acknowledged his error. But it wasn't just about the apology. It was about the lessons that had been learned along the way. The crew, the passengers, and even Aisha herself had been forced to think about the way they viewed others and the assumptions they made based on appearances. She looked out the window again, watching the clouds drift by beneath the plane. Her thoughts returned to her career in the Navy. She had worked hard to reach the position she held, and she had faced countless challenges along the way. She had to prove herself every day, to show others that she was capable and deserving of her rank. Sometimes it felt like an uphill battle, but moments like this reminded her why she kept going. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing all the women and men who had worked so hard to break down the barriers that stood in their way. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendants moved through the cabin again. This time, their faces were filled with warmth and respect as they offered Aisha a drink and checked on her comfort. The young attendant who had first approached her earlier smiled shyly as she handed Aisha a cup of water. "Thank you again, Lieutenant Commander," the attendant said softly. "I really appreciate your understanding. You've taught us all an important lesson today." Aisha smiled back, grateful for the kind words. It's not about being understanding. It's about recognizing that we all deserve respect, no matter what. The attendant nodded, her eyes filled with genuine appreciation. "You're absolutely right," she said. "I'll never forget this lesson." Aisha felt a sense of pride swell inside her. It wasn't just about the apology or the recognition she had received. It was about the change that had taken place. She had turned a challenging situation into an opportunity for growth, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. As the plane landed and the passengers began to gather their belongings, many of them stopped by Aisha's seat to thank her for her patience and for reminding them of the importance of treating others with dignity. Aisha nodded and smiled, but in her heart, she knew that the real reward wasn't the thanks she had received. It was knowing that she had made a difference. As the plane touched down at its destination, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Thompson felt a sense of calm wash over her. The flight had been long, but she had learned something important, not just about herself, but about others too. Throughout the flight, she had faced a situation that at first seemed like a simple misunderstanding, but it had turned into something much deeper. The way the flight attendants had initially treated her, the assumptions they had made based on her uniform and appearance, had revealed the unconscious biases that many people held. But in the end, what mattered was how she handled it, and how others had responded to her. Aisha knew that this wouldn't be the last time she would face a moment like this. It was part of her reality, part of the challenge she had accepted when she chose to pursue a career in the Navy. But this time, she had shown those around her the value of standing up for herself and demanding the respect she deserved. And perhaps just as importantly, she had reminded them that assumptions about people could be dangerous, even if they weren't intended to harm. As the passengers stood and began to gather their things, a few of them stopped by Aisha's seat. They smiled at her, some of them offering quiet nods of acknowledgement, others thanking her for the lesson they had learned. Aisha, ever the professional, smiled back, but inside, she felt a sense of pride. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. One of the passengers, a woman who had been sitting across the aisle, approached her with a warm smile. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "You handled everything so gracefully, and you taught all of us something today. I think we all learned a lot." Aisha smiled politely, nodding in acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, but the lesson wasn't just mine to teach. We all have something to learn from each other." The woman smiled again, clearly grateful for the exchange. "I'll never forget this. I'll be more mindful of how I treat others from now on." Aisha felt a warm sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of change she had hoped for. Small, quiet moments where people could reflect on their actions and realize how they could be better. It wasn't about confronting people or calling them out. It was about helping them understand, in a way that was kind but firm, that everyone deserved respect. As Aisha made her way off the plane, she couldn't help but think about her role in the Navy and the many more challenges that awaited her. She had earned every part of her journey, from her rank to the recognition she had received today. She had worked hard to prove herself, and even though it wasn't always easy, she knew it was worth it. The world, in many ways, still had a long way to go when it came to equality and respect for all people, but Aisha was proud to be part of the change. As she walked through the airport toward her next assignment, she thought about how she could continue to be a force for good in her own small way. She had learned that even in the most challenging moments, there was always an opportunity to teach, to inspire, and to change the way people thought. And that was a lesson worth carrying with her, no matter where she went.